Hey guys, it's KJ from the Scariest Movie Ever channel on YouTube. Over the last several years, there's been a drastic increase in these mass shooter events taking place all around the world. And I found something very interesting starts to develop when you investigate each and every one of these attacks. There are lots of strange coincidences that pull many of these events together. So in this video, I'm going to be exploring multiple of these mass events and taking a look at some of the strange connections and coincidences we find within. But first, I'd like to thank my sponsor, Virtual Shield. At some point in your online career, you've heard of a VPN. A VPN, or a virtual private network, allows you to create a secure connection to another network over the internet. VPNs can be used in a variety of ways, specifically to access region-restricted websites, and shielding your browsing activity from prying eyes on public Wi-Fi, also protecting you from identity theft. Here, let me show you how easy this is. Just go to www.virtualshield.com and download the free 30-day trial. And then you go to your Virtual Shield and simply click Connect. And then once you're connected, your IP address changes. As you can see at the bottom here, my new IP address is from Dallas, Texas. In other words, if you don't want websites, the government, advertisers, or just your annoying household members or roommates to know what websites you visit and what location you're visiting them from, invest in a VPN now. I personally use Virtual Shield because it's the easiest, fastest, and most secure VPN on the market. And while we're seeing this increase of censorship and surveillance online, they don't store logs on their servers, and I trust that. Trust me, you'll be pleased that you did. And you really shouldn't be surfing the internet without a VPN these days. Did you know that in many of these cases of these mass events, that the alleged attackers that carried out these events had been contacted by the FBI prior to the event? For instance, in Boston, the FBI and U.S. law enforcement were sent via Russia a warning about Tamerlan Tsarnaev. The FBI allegedly interviewed the suspects and let them go, even opting against investigating them later, after a second warning swept through the department from Russian officials. We can even look to the Fort Hood shooting. In a string of emails sent to the FBI, soldier Nidal Hassan openly admitted that he wanted his fellow soldiers dead in order to protect the Taliban. Officials failed to intervene, leading to a tragedy that resulted in the death of 31 Americans. Ahmad Khan Rahami, whose own father alerted officials of the radicalization of his own son. After a brief interview, Rahami was cleared by FBI officials, though he eventually injured 31 people between New Jersey and New York. We also have the Pulse nightclub event, and yet another attack on American soil. 49 people were killed and another 53 wounded after a Marma teen opened fire through its doors. And despite a 10-month investigation of the would-be shooter, during which he admitted to lying to officials, the FBI decided against taking any further action. And then we have the Garland, Texas event. In a report from CBS, the FBI had an undercover agent traveling with Islamists Elton Simpson and Nadir Sufi for intel on a pending attack during a, quote, Draw Muhammad event in Garland, Texas. Not only did officials know of a pending attack, but had refused to comment on why their agent didn't intervene when the attack took place. Shortly before the Parkland massacre, a YouTube vlogger named Ben the Knight had noticed some alarming declarations coming from crews that had been left on one of his videos in the comments section. He took a screenshot of these comments before removing them and sent them to the FBI. Officials responded immediately and requested an in-person interview with Mr. Benight the next day. He said they came to my office the next morning and asked if I knew anything about the person. He said, I don't know anything about him. They took a copy of the screenshot, and that was the last time I ever heard of him. We also have the South Carolina massacre at the hands of Dylan Roof, who was allegedly cleared by the FBI to buy firearms. Then Director of the FBI James Comey admitted that it was merely an error in the background check system that eventually allowed Roof to kill 9 parishioners in cold blood. Nearly every mass shooting incident in the last 20 years and multiple other instances of suicide and isolated shootings all share one thing in common, and that's not the weapons that were used. The overwhelming evidence points to the single largest common factor in all of these incidents is the fact that all of the perpetrators were either actively taking powerful psychotropic drugs or had been at some point in the immediate past before they committed their crimes. Multiple credible scientific studies going back more than a decade, as well as internal documents from certain pharmaceutical companies that suppressed the information, show that SSRI drugs have well-known but unreported side effects, including but not limited to suicide and other violent behavior. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were both on Zoloft and also Luvox. Jeff Weiss, age 16, had been prescribed 60 milligrams a day of Prozac, which was 3 times the average starting dose for adults, when he shot his grandfather, his grandfather's girlfriend, and many fellow students at Red Lake, Minnesota. Corey Badsgard, age 16, Waluka, Washington State High School, was on Paxil, which caused him to have hallucinations when he took a rifle to his high school and held 23 classmates hostage. To this day, he claims to have no memory of the event. Christopher Pittman, at the age of 12, murdered both his grandparents while taking Zoloft. Matthew Miller, age 13, hung himself in his bedroom closet after taking Zoloft for just 6 days. Kip Kinkel, age 15, was on Prozac and Ritalin when he shot his parents while they slept. Then he went to school and opened fire, killing 2 classmates and injuring 22 shortly after beginning Prozac treatment. Luke Woodham, at the age of 16, was on Prozac when he killed his mother and then killed 2 students, wounding 6 others. Michael Carneal, at the age of 14, was on Ritalin when he opened fire on students at a high school prayer meeting in West Kentucky. Andrew Golden, age 11, and Mitchell Johnson, just aged 14, both on Ritalin, shot 15 people, killing 4 students, 1 teacher, and wounding 10 others. TJ Solomon was 15 and also on Ritalin when he opened fire on his Georgia classmates, wounding 6. Rod Matthews, also on Ritalin, at the age of 14, beat one of his classmates to death with a baseball bat. James Wilson, at the age of 19, was said to have been on multiple psychiatric drugs. He took a .22 caliber revolver into an elementary school, taking the lives of 2 young girls and wounding 7 other children and 2 teachers. Jeff Franklin from Huntsville, Alabama, was on both Prozac and Ritalin when he killed his parents using a sledgehammer, a hatchet, a butcher knife, and also a merchant's file. Once they did an investigation on Jeff Franklin, they were also able to connect this crime to his satanic beliefs. To give you a full and complete list of all of the young people who've been affected by these drugs and this medication would take forever. So I wanted to highlight a few of the more high-profile cases. So now I want to cover another interesting anomaly we find around a lot of these events. Hours before the terror attacks Paris practiced for a mass shooting, time and time again we'll find that there was some kind of a government drill happening at the exact same time as some of these events, or just prior to. And the same thing happened at the Charleston church event. The Department of Homeland Security just happened to be running, quote, shooter drills the exact same day. And once again, Department of Homeland Security documents prove Boston Marathon bombing false flag because a drill was actually planned months in advance. We find this interesting connection once again with the Batman Aurora theater shooting. Colorado University had an identical drill on the same day as the Batman massacre. Here's another example. Paris emergency drill occurred on the same day as the attacks. We also have this story from the Oslo attacks. Norwegian police confirmed drill identical to Breivik's attack. Then, of course, we have this example from the London 7/7 attack. A fictional scenario of multiple bomb attacks on London's underground took place at exactly the same time as the bomb attack on July 7, 2005. The further we dig, the deeper this all gets. So I'm covering multiple threads, multiple connections in this video, but this is definitely interactive. I look forward to hearing your thoughts below in the comments section concerning many of these events and these strange connections we're uncovering here. And none of this is in any particular order. If anything, this is just kind of a free flow of thought And I look forward to you coming along with me on the ride, and once again, let's do this together. I look forward to seeing your comments and your thoughts below. I thought this was interesting considering the Nicholas Cruz event. Florida shooter made sick use of school's active shooter drill. So there's no denying the drill actually took place. It's interesting how now they're trying to connect the two. And of course, right after that story comes out, now they have this. After the Parkland situation, a push for more school shooting drills. So we've already seen this connection with many of these drills and the actual events taking place, which is suspect, wouldn't you say? Seung-Hui Cho is an interesting case. As I said, we find a lot of interesting connections between a lot of these events. I believe that in some of these cases, some of these young people who are carrying out these events are groomed to do so. I believe some of them are set up to take the fall for the event. And then, of course, in other cases, some of these people are actually involved in committing these crimes. But have they been manipulated? Were their minds controlled somehow? I also consider the spiritual component to all of this. Have some of these people become possessed, taken on a wicked entity? So let's take a look here at Seung-Hui Cho. It's alleged that between the first and second shootings that he actually sent a tape to NBC. And on that tape, he says, "This is it. This is where it all ends. Ends of the road. What a life it was. I did it for them. I did it to make you stop what you did to me, the future generations of the weak and defenseless. Like Moses, I split the sea and led my people, the weak, the defenseless, the innocent children of all ages." Railing against the wealthy and presumably other unnamed enemies, Cho added, "You had everything you wanted. Your Mercedes wasn't enough, you brats. Your golden necklaces weren't enough, you snobs. Your trust fund wasn't enough. Your vodka and cognac weren't enough. All your debaucheries weren't enough. Those weren't enough to fulfill your hedonistic needs. You had everything." Cho also included a number of photos he probably took of himself. In the first two, Cho is seen smiling. The rest, though, Cho looking stern, aiming his handguns at the camera or at nothing.
"You had 100 billion chances and ways to have avoided today, but you decided to spill my blood. You forced me into a corner and gave me only one option. The decision was yours." "I could have left. I could have fled. But now, I will no longer run. If not for me, for my children, for my brothers and sisters, the chief."
In 1999, when Cho was in the 8th grade, he became transfixed by the horrors of the April 20th Columbine shootings. His fascination with the massacre came out in his schoolwork. I remember sitting in Spanish class with him right next to him and there being something written on his binder to the effect of, "F you all, I hope you all burn in hell," which I would assume meant us, the students, said Ben Baldwin. In a class assignment, Cho wrote about wanting to, quote, "repeat Columbine." A veteran child psychologist and member of the official Virginia Tech review panel noted, "It appeared as though the Columbine shooting set off in his mind the fantasies around suicide and homicide which were picked up in a class essay, and as was picked up by the teacher, who then sought the parents out and suggested that he be evaluated, and which led to the psychiatric evaluation and the intensification of the counseling." And of course we have this component right here. Cho was diagnosed with a severe anxiety disorder, major depression, and selective mutism. He was then put on Paxil, an antidepressant medication, for 1 year. Another component that we see turn up in many of these mass shooters is the idea that these people themselves are incels, or involuntary celibate.
Tomorrow is the day of retribution. The day in which I will have my revenge.
Soon after posting this video to YouTube, Elliot Rodger would go on a shooting spree in the California city of Santa Barbara, killing 6 and injuring many others.
Shots fired, shots fired.
The attack, a form of revenge by an angry young man, one who was hell-bent on blaming women for his own personal loneliness.
The girls are not sexually attracted to me. There's a major problem with that. A major problem. That's a problem that I intend to rectify.
More and more male hatred against women is rising up through the hidden crevices of online forums and entering real life. Allegedly the inspiration behind the mass attacks in Santa Barbara, Toronto, and Tallahassee, Florida. And experts say one of the chief incubators of this violent misogyny is a subculture of men and some women who call themselves incels or involuntary celibates. They mainly gather in online forums, finding common ground in their shared loneliness, hatred of themselves, and anger toward the opposite sex.
Women are just evil. You know what I'm saying? Women are evil, women are cruel, women are mean.
The group name that you've probably never heard of before, incels or involuntary celibate.
Now a new BBC documentary, Inside the Secret World of Incels, presents a never-before-seen look at this community online and off.
I think it's fair to say a lot of people have not heard of the term incels and have not heard about the incel community. I think it's certainly something that more people should know about because there is a risk of violence from this community.
When the incel movement first began online in the late 90s, it was seen by many as a comforting resource, a place to belong for those who had no sense of belonging.
Whenever I see couples walking about, I'm happy for them, but at the same time, I'm also just like, oh man, I am so alone. It hurts a little bit.
Forums can definitely be, very supportive. Having an online community to fall back on or to go to is definitely a source of comfort.
It's a space that Jack Peterson sought out as a struggling teenager.
I think what attracts men to the incel communities is just feeling like they have no other place to go. If they're rejected by women, if they're rejected by even men, the incel community is a place for them to congregate and actually find people to talk to for once, rather than just stay in isolation.
It was a world where he could freely post this video.
No matter what I do, no matter where I go, nobody values my contributions, nobody respects me.
Peterson eventually became a moderator for one of the incel forums. He says violent talk and threats were not tolerated.
Cho had told his roommate that he had a girlfriend. This was a surprise to virtually everyone since Cho is not known for going on dates or socializing with women on campus. His girlfriend's name was Jelly. She was a supermodel who lived in outer space and traveled by spaceship. When one of his roommates returned to their suite one day, Cho sent him away. He told him that Jelly was there. Her pet name for Cho was Spanky. Spanky Jelly became his instant message screen name. At the same time, Cho became infatuated with several female students. 2 of them complained to police that he was harassing them with unwanted phone calls, showing up at their rooms, and sending them countless instant messages. They agreed that Cho was bothersome but not threatening, but after the second complaint against Cho surfaced in December 2005, police approached Cho and told him to stop. Roy and at least one Virginia Tech professor tried to get Cho help, even reaching out to the Cook Counseling Center on campus. I did call on several occasions and said this young man does seem to be troubled, Roy said. I used stronger language than that, and I would have appreciated a more bold response. It seems that Cho understood he was spiraling out of control. He contacted the Cook Counseling Center 4 times, once in person, but little was done, or so it seems. And here's the really interesting part. Somehow the records of Cho's treatment went missing. Cho's mental health records were discovered 2 years later in the home of Robert C. Miller, the former director of the university's counseling clinic and Cho's former therapist. The records were discovered by lawyers preparing for a civil lawsuit filed in 2009 by families of 2 of the 32 people murdered by Cho. Miller actually left his position at the Cook Counseling Center a year before the Virginia Tech massacre took place. In 2007, when the university was conducting a search for the records, Miller claimed he didn't know where they were. This means Miller took the records home, hid them, and failed to tell police where they were, knowing police were looking for them. Robert Hawkins, the Omaha shooter. Omaha shooter Robert Hawkins had been treated for ADHD and depression. Once again, we find this connection with the medication. Here's something interesting I found in this case with Hawkins. Video of the department store's south entrance shows Hawkins entering the festooned store and immediately walking to the elevator to his right. His right hand was tight against his midsection to hide what police said was an AK-47. Other footage released showed people fleeing the store and the first police officer on the scene walking in with gun drawn. Police did not release video of the shooting, but released a still image from the tape that showed Hawkins with his sleeves rolled up, aiming the AK to fire in front of a store mannequin. So here's where it gets interesting. The photos appear to contradict earlier reports that the gunman had a military-style haircut and entered the mall wearing a camouflage vest. Also, the note made no mention of widely reported broadcast reports that he wrote he wanted to, quote, go out in style. It's interesting how often the official story changes over the first 24 to 48 hours anytime one of these events take place. And this is a very common narrative we find. Many times the eyewitness aren't describing the person that's being blamed, they're describing people in military-style clothing or wearing masks. Stephen Kazmierzak, the Northern Illinois University shooter. And in his case, we find another history of mental illness. According to AP, he spent more than a year at the Thresholds Mary Hill House in the late 1990s, an alternative high school program for children suffering from mental illness. His parents sent him there because he was, quote, unruly. After he graduated in 1998, he underwent a year of psychiatric hospitalization at the insistence of his parents because he refused to take his meds and was cutting himself, a behavior often associated with the B or dramatic cluster of personality disorders such as borderline and narcissistic. Also with Robert Hawkins, this piece right here, he had been taking antidepressants, but his problems only seemed to be getting worse. Shooter Jared Lee Loughner. Good luck finding this particular story on Jared Lee Loughner. I had to do some digging on this one, but I remembered this when it all first came out, this whole situation. Gabrielle Gifford's shooting, frightening twisted shrine in Arizona killer Jared Lee Loughner's yard. This was our occult, satanic connection to this particular killer. This is yet another one of those themes I find turning up time and time again around some of these people. I believe this young man was clearly not in his right mind. And sometimes it's not even about the event itself, it's the way the narrative falls into place afterwards, or how the mainstream wants to use each one of these situations to their own ends. And typically that means gun control. But even in this case, I remember the mainstream narrative was calling this young man a conspiracy theorist. So story after story after story for weeks was talking about the conspiracy theorist that committed the crime. Obviously, the idea of fringe topics is going to draw in all kinds of people, and some of those people that are going to connect with the stranger subjects aren't going to necessarily be well when it comes to their mental health. Check out this video. This was recorded from Jared Lee Loughner himself, and this gives us a little bit of a glimpse into the way his mind works.
Alright, so here's what we're doing. We're examining the torture of students. We are looking at students who have been tortured. They're at low income pay in 2 wars. The war that we are in right now is currently illegal under the Constitution. What makes it illegal is the currency. The date is also wrong. It's impossible for it to be that date. It's mind control. How's it going? Thanks for the bee. I'm pissed off.
What's that?
I lost my freedom of speech to that guy. And this is what happens. And I'm in a terrible place. It's the school that I go to. This is my genocide school, where I'm gonna be homeless because of the school. I haven't forgot the teacher that gave me the B for freedom of speech. So my sociology class was. And then here's the microwave that I'll be using when I'm homeless. This is the cafeteria, they make illegal transactions. This is Pima Community College, one of the biggest scams in America. The students are so illiterate that it affects their daily lives. Here's the best part, the bookstore. The bookstore, the bookstore, the bookstore. It is so illegal to sell this book under the Constitution. We are also censored by our freedom of speech. They're controlling the grammar. They control the grammar. This is the police station. This is where the whole shaboozy goes down with illegal activity.
It also appears that Jared Lee Loughner was having some issues with his own sexuality. Police find photos of Arizona gunman bizarrely posing with his firearm while wearing a red G-string, which were developed the morning of the massacre. So another interesting coincidence we find with a lot of these cases is we'll find a lot of the same actors, if you will, playing the same roles for each one of these people. Jared Loughner, lawyer, appointed to Sarnev case. Of course, Sarnev is connected to the Boston bombing event. Fort Hood shooter Ivan Lopez. Fort Hood gunman Ivan Lopez posted a chilling Facebook status weeks before his deadly rampage, in which he said the devil had taken him and that he was full of hatred. Eduardo Cencion, the IHOP shooter. Again, we find a spiritual component here. Eduardo Cencion, IHOP shooter, was convinced demons were after him. Investigators say his family first became aware of mental health issues when Cencion complained about being harassed by coworkers. He sought treatment when his employer told the family he was becoming increasingly paranoid. Family members said Cencion took his medication, so again, on medication, and all but one of his mental health commitments were voluntary. The report did not say how many times Cencion was hospitalized, but he had told his family he avoided intimate relationships because he feared, quote, he would father a child and pass along his illness. He immersed himself in the Bible and gave his mother keys to his gun safe, warning her that he was, quote, getting sick. He thought people were demons trying to hurt him, and he began hearing voices telling him to, quote, do bad things to people. His medications had been changed over the summer. About a month later, he approached a priest in the street and asked him for help, telling the priest, quote, they're telling me to do bad things. James Holmes, the Aurora, Colorado shooter. This is certainly one of the most intriguing cases when it comes to a mass shooter. In this case, we find elements of government mind control, eyewitness reports of multiple shooters, and more unusual inconsistencies. Police audio suggests there were multiple shooters in the Dark Knight massacre. According to police radio transmissions at 6:15, an officer found, quote, a suspect in a gas mask, and another officer asked, is that the dude in the white car you're by? After a few transmissions, an officer asks at 6:49, that white car in the rear of the lot, is that a suspect? The response is, yes, we've got rifles, gas mask. He's detained right now. I've got an open door going into the theater. Skeptics cite this exchange as evidence that Holmes was found in his locked car with a gas mask on and heavily drugged, not outside the car as Oates said, which would have forced first responders to break the passenger side window and get a white stretcher board in preparation to transport him. 3 minutes after Holmes was detained in by his car, an officer says at 9:58, one of the shooters might be wearing a white and blue plaid shirt, and the dispatcher responds, copy, outstanding shooter possibly wearing a white and blue plaid shirt. An officer says at 11:43, the suspect is saying that he's the only one, but I'm getting conflicting suspect descriptions from the witnesses out here. Then the dispatcher receives several updates at 24:42 and says, copy all units, male with a red backpack and another one possibly in black clothing headed towards Alameda Avenue. Subsequently, an officer says at 25 minutes, suspect is going to be male, unknown race, black camo type outfit, believed to be wearing a vest, gas mask, and multiple long guns. Witness says someone let Dark Knight shooter in through the emergency door.
What did you feel when you saw the picture of that guy in court today, Corbin, James Holmes?
Honestly, as soon as I was watching the trial on CNN today, I felt completely numb. I felt no emotion whatsoever when I was looking at the face of the gunman.
Did he look dangerous to you? Did he remind you of what you saw in the theater?
Honestly, looking at his face right now, no, he looked like an average person that you would see probably at a mall or at anywhere common. You would not put two and two together if you saw that person and if you were there that night. You would never know.
Okay, compare him to what you saw, the gentleman you saw, or the two gentlemen, whatever you saw. Compare him to what you saw in the theater the night that that everything went horribly.
The night in the theater, as soon as the door swung open and the person dressed all in black walked into the theater, this person had a stroll like he knew what was going on, like he knew what was supposed to happen, like it was supposed to be a walk in the park and that he was going to have a good time. That's what it looked like.
Is there any way you can connect the two? Could you identify him as that guy, the one who killed all the 12 people and injured or wounded so many others, dozens of others?
I couldn't have identified him because the gunman was dressed all in black. You could not see anything. The only thing that was available to see was only his eyes.
I got to be careful about presumption of innocence, even in a case that gets so graphic as this. Let me go back quickly to Corbin Dates. Was there one or two people involved in this? I've heard that you believe there might have been two, not just one.
I couldn't speculate, but the way from what I saw before the gunman walking in acted out, it seemed like there was two. But I couldn't speculate because I did not know what happened after that door had shut before it swung back open.
I think you told one of our producers that the person you saw going out of the theater to get and come back, whoever came back in, the one who went out had a goatee.
Yes.
Go ahead.
That's correct, yeah. Prior to the movie even starting, when I came and got my seat at the theater, a guy walked in into the auditorium after me, sat into the very first right row, and got a phone call. Took his phone call towards the emergency exit, not the lobby, and had his foot propped open by the door. It seemed like he was making gestures of trying to find somebody or trying to have somebody come to his location to where he currently was. After that, I had already stepped out of the auditorium to bring my friend in, and when we came back, the movie was just starting, lights were dimming, and that door seemed closed.
And you testified to all this in court?
Yes.
Thursday and like at 7 o'clock. Thursday. Mm-hmm.
So that's only like hours before you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. He's two person. What is the name?
James Holmes.
Yeah. Another guy. It's running the 17th Street to his apartment. Running.
Was his hair orange and red?
Yeah, like orange.
This is from naturalnews.com. Holmes was clearly provided with exotic gear and bomb-making skills. He said pictures from inside the apartment are fairly disturbing and the devices look to be sophisticated, adding the booby traps were, quote, something I've never seen. 1 rifle, 2 handguns, a knife, a bulletproof vest, a ballistic helmet, gas device, gas mask, military SWAT clothing, and unidentified explosives were also found in Holmes' car, a law enforcement source told CBS News. Oates said Holmes wore a gas mask, a ballistic helmet, and vest, as well as leg, groin, and throat protectors during the shooting. That story alone doesn't add up to eyewitness accounts. It's also interesting that they seem to use some kind of Joker programming. Holmes even described himself as the Joker from the Batman movies. So this definitely goes along with that kind of a narrative that he was some kind of an evil genius, right? Like a Joker-type villain. In other words, this guy was equipped with exotic gear by someone with connections to military equipment. SWAT clothing, explosives, complex booby traps. This isn't a lone gunman. This is somebody who was selected for a mission, given equipment to carry it out, then somehow brainwashed into getting it done. And this is a great question. How does an unemployed medical student afford $20,000 in weapons and gear? If you start to look at the really big picture here, the obvious question arises, how does an unemployed medical student afford all the complex weapons, gear, bomb-making gear, flammable booby trap devices, ammunition, multiple magazines, bulletproof vest, groin protection, ballistic helmet, SWAT uniform, and all the rest of it? So we find some more possible connections to the mind control psyop taking place here. This story came out in 2012, James Holmes, Inmate's Strange Tale of Confession and Suicide Efforts. Stephen Unruh was an inmate serving at the same time as James Holmes, and he claims he had a long discussion with him. He says, "They're going to try to discredit my story, but I was able to have a 4-hour talk with him. I talked him out of suicide." He says that Holmes told him he, quote, felt like he was in a video game during the shooting, and that he, quote, wasn't on his meds and nobody would help him. He says Holmes also mentioned NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, a much scorned and outmoded approach to psychotherapy, and claimed to have been, quote, programmed to kill by an evil therapist. When he got out of his car, he wasn't programmed no more, Unruh says. It sounded kind of crazy. He was trying to run it by me, basically. So even more interesting, if we consider that information to be true, that perhaps he was programmed by a, quote, evil therapist, well, we have this story came out. James Holmes, psychiatrist, warned of threat before attack. So again, was this perhaps part of a setup? Part of setting up the narrative? So here's another potential piece of the puzzle I found. I thought this was interesting. Aurora apartment fire kills 2, injures 15, building less than a block away from shooting suspect James Holmes' apartment. When you read further in the story, it reminds me of a voice-to-skull type technology. Or perhaps this guy was just crazy, but either way, this is what happened in the apartment just a few blocks away from James Holmes' apartment. The landlords failed to evict the gentleman despite numerous complaints about his bizarre behavior. She claims the man complained to the building manager that antennae on the roof were affecting his, quote, brainwaves. When the manager refused to remove the antenna, the tenant poured gasoline in front of the manager's door and set fire that killed neighbors on both sides of Rafa's apartment. According to the complaint, 24 other people were injured. Something else we find with a lot of these events is that many of these alleged shooters always seem to have a massive manifesto. Have you ever noticed that? There's always some massive manifesto where they explain everything they did. Sometimes it's just, insane rantings, much like this, but they always seem to have a massive manifesto. Here's another anomaly we find in many of these events. Anytime something like this takes place, we immediately want to see the footage. But so many times there's no footage to see, at least so we're told. Surveillance cameras turned off during the Sikh temple shooting. We find something else very interesting with this Sikh temple shooter. He apparently worked in Army psychological operations. And even right here it's highlighted. The Batman shooter James Holmes was also connected to an Army psychiatrist. Also with the Sikh temple shooting, we have people alleging that there were multiple gunmen there.
Day starts around 10:30, and usually goes in the afternoon, and around between 10 and 10:30, 4 white males who were dressed darkly, dressed in all black clothing, came in and opened fire on our congregation. And from what I'm told, about 20 to 25 people have been hit.
This is from an article on MotherJones.com, but once again it goes to show you how oftentimes they'll frame the narrative and they'll blame video games for a lot of these shooters. My theory is that they probably use video games in some fashion to program some of these people. It's like that story from James Holmes' cellmate saying that he felt he was in a video game. So again, this is just a theory. Perhaps they use some kind of a game technology to program some of these people. And then once the event takes place, the media takes the narrative that it's video games that created this. Aaron Alexis, the Naval Yard shooter. So once again, we find violent video games a part of the narrative with Aaron Alexis. We mentioned voice-to-skull technology a little bit earlier in the video, and that also comes to play right here, I believe, in this case with Aaron Alexis.
The Navy Yard shooting, the warning signs were there. ABC News has learned that shooter Aaron Alexis was kicked out of Navy housing just weeks before his rampage because he was raving about voices in his head. ABC's Pierre Thomas is tracking the investigation from Washington. Good morning, Pierre.
Good morning, George. Today, even more warning signs missed and disturbing new details about how the suspect had free rein to kill those victims. Law enforcement sources tell ABC News Aaron Alexis abruptly left a Newport, Rhode Island Navy barracks after constantly complaining that noises were coming out of his linen closet. During roughly the same time frame, Newport Naval Station police were warned by local authorities that Alexis was hearing voices and feared he was under constant surveillance by shadowy figures. But Navy Station police did not pass the information up the chain of command.
There should have been some kind of mental health assessment done in order to determine the severity of these hallucinations.
Alexis's mental state appeared to be rapidly deteriorating. 6 days before Alexis, a practicing Buddhist, came to Washington, he went to a temple complaining to monks that he was hearing voices.
He said he doesn't like stay in the hotel. When he sleep, he hear a noise.
Sources tell ABC News the FBI is investigating whether Alexis targeted specific co-workers. And new FBI Director James Comey told reporters disturbing new details Thursday. He said Alexis was working on a computer server program in Navy Yard Building 197, which allowed him to enter and move about the facility freely. And we learned he sawed off his shotgun with a hacksaw bought at a Home Depot and hid it in a bag, walking right by security. The FBI director said Alexis appeared to be hunting people in a random way without pattern. So much heartache. On Sunday, President Obama plans to attend a service honoring the fallen. Robin?
We continue to think about them, Pierre. Thank you.
Elliot Rodger, the Santa Monica Massacre. It was this story that really brought the idea of the incel to the masses. And from this story, we were able to draw many connections to other so-called solo shooters. Many of these men fall in this category of involuntary celibate. At least this is something that many of them have claimed for themselves. So we do find this narrative of misogynistic, women-hating men carrying out some of these crimes. But as in the case of so many of these events, we find some interesting anomalies. As with so many of these other events, this young man created a 140-page manifesto called his Twisted World. His father has ties to Hollywood, and we also find out that the Santa Barbara shooter's therapist has ties with Hollywood as well. So did his therapists fail, or were they part of the programming? And we also find that just blocks away from the actual event, there was an active shooter drill that was set to take place on May 28th. I will have my revenge against humanity, 22-year-old Elliot Rodger promised in a video uploaded to YouTube in 2014, shortly before he walked into a UC Santa Barbara sorority house and slaughtered 6 people. I'm 22 years old and still a virgin, he complained. I've had to rot in loneliness. It's not fair. His massacre, he said, was something the world deserved, quote, just for the crime of living a better life than me. For all his complaining, though, Rodger didn't exactly have low self-esteem. He called himself the perfect guy and the supreme gentleman, promising that after he had killed, they would see that he was the true alpha male. He had a delusion that he is a god compared to the rest of humanity, and after the massacre he believed the world would see him the way he saw himself. His agony didn't just come from self-hatred. He had delusions of grandeur, and when the world didn't reciprocate his narcissism, he saw it as their fault, not his. Women, he declared, should not have the right to choose who to mate and breed with, because by not choosing him, they'd shown they couldn't make the right choice. Eric Harris. Someone's bound to say, what were they thinking? Eric Harris wrote in his journal days before he and his friend Dylan Klebold walked into Columbine High School. This is what I'm thinking. I have a goal to destroy as much as possible. Dylan Klebold. While Harris filled his journal with furious condemnations of humanity, Dylan Klebold's journal was full of poems and a deep longing for some type of human connection. Klebold didn't see himself as a human. He mused in his diary about when he, quote, got covered up by this entity that had taken over his body. In other entries, he called himself a non-human or a god, and he believed that he was the god of sadness. If that doesn't sound like demonic possession, I don't know what does. Caleb Sharp. Some of the things Sharp wrote in his notebooks before the massacre reveal the depths of his madness. Like Dylan Klebold, he wrote some of his notes as if he were another entity living in a young boy's body. I am the one who deserved to live, but I still need Caleb until I kill all those kids, Caleb wrote, apparently imagining he was possessed by something else. Then Caleb will finally die while I live on. Luke Woodham. He'd spent his life being teased by classmates and taunted by his mother, he claimed, and was tired of watching Johnny football player get the glory. He started moving into different circles, joining a clique of self-proclaimed Satanists who encouraged his violent tendencies and, according to Woodham, helped him plan the massacre. To get ready to kill, Woodham crushed his dog's head in and set it on fire. It's hard to say, though, how much of what Woodham says is true. According to the police, Luke had psychotic processing and misinterpreted reality. He claimed his friend Grant Boyette had pushed him into killing, but he also said that he had seen demons that encouraged him to kill. Dylan Roof, the Charleston church event. I've mentioned in other videos and broadcasts that it's very obvious there's a narrative at play in the mainstream right now. That narrative is all about a race war, a civil war in America. And this is another example. The mainstream used this story on Dylan Roof to continue to push forward that propaganda. As with so many of these other solo shooters, we find Dylan Roof also has a manifesto. But it's interesting because after this manifesto was released to the media, it didn't take long for people to start picking it apart and realizing there were some major inconsistencies there. So the question then became, who actually wrote this manifesto? Also, like many of these events, we find an active shooter response training course was taking place in Charleston, June 15th through June 19th, 2015. The date surrounding the 17th, the date of the actual Charleston attack. Chris Harper Mercer, the Oregon shooter. Again, we find many of the common connections between these solo shooters. I wanted to throw this one in there as well. I remember this when it first came out. CNN turns mixed-race Oregon shooter into a white man. And you can see their version on the right-hand side. LA Times claimed Mercer was a white supremacist. So once again, we catch these mainstream sources creating the narrative. And of course, he too has a massive manifesto. Here I am, 26, with no friends, no job, no girlfriend, so they're going with the incel narrative as well. Shooter's manifesto offers clues to 2015 Oregon college rampage. Shooter linked to military and private security firm. In 2008, Harper Mercer also had a brief stint in the U.S. Army. According to the Pentagon, Harper Mercer was enrolled in basic training for less than a month before being discharged for failing to meet the minimum administrative standards to serve in the U.S. Army. In 2012 through 2013, he sought to join an organization called 7-4 Para, described as a private self-defense and law enforcement training academy in Torrance, California. The narrative goes that he was, quote, turned away by the academy's president and head instructor. We also find the connection to the active shooter drills. Various police and fire agencies from Central Oregon participated in a large active shooter drill at the college about a year ago. And if you look on the bottom, on February 27, 2015, the Oregon Department of Corrections also had an active shooter drill, and that designated staff will, quote, fire blanks as part of that exercise. In all of my years of investigating fringe-type topics, this is one of the strangest true crime cases I've ever seen. Kalamazoo shooter saw the devil on Uber app and blames visions for killing spree. Jason Dalton, Uber driver who killed 6 people in Michigan, says a smartphone app takes over, quote, your whole body and is undergoing psychiatric evaluation. Dalton told police that when he opened the ride-sharing app, he recognized the Uber symbol as being that of the Eastern Star, and that a devil head would pop up on his screen. He said that was when all the problems started. Dalton said that the iPhone can take you over. He said he wishes he would never have spoken what that symbol was when he saw it on his phone. Dalton described the devil figure as a horned cow head, and then it would give you an assignment, and it would literally take over your whole body. Dalton also told police that he did not drink or smoke and was not on psychotic or psychosis drugs, adding that he was not in bad financial straits and did not consider himself an anti-government or militia-type person. Nicholas Cruz, the Parkland shooter. Nicholas Cruz is another one of these solo shooters that was on psych medication. And this is also a case where eyewitness reports conflict with the official narrative.
True is a senior at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. He says Wednesday he was on the other side of the school next to the garden when the fire drill started. He says at first everyone lined up outside as normal, but then they were pushed further away toward the fence near a local middle school. And he says that's when he saw Nicholas Cruz walk right by him.
I remember seeing Nick Cruz walk past me. He was looking down, it was around 3:20, I guess, and he walked right past me. And my friend Alexa and I, we noticed him, but we didn't really say much. And apparently, he greeted, some people greeted him, and he greeted back as normal.
We were walking the whole class together. I actually was speaking to the suspect, Nicholas Cruz. He was trouble in middle school, so I kind of joked to him about it and said, "I'm surprised you weren't the one who did it." And he just gave me a huh? And the shots were coming from the other part of the building. So there definitely had to be two shooters involved, I believe.
He was legit, he just ran up the stairs, started shooting, and you could see a bunch of kids just going down that way, but stopping, but because the other shooter was coming.
And I suddenly saw the shooter about 20 feet from me, standing at the end of the hallway, actively shooting down the hallway, just a barrage of bullets. And I'm staring at him thinking, why is the police here? This is strange, because he's in full metal garb, helmet, face mask, bulletproof armor, shooting this rifle that I've never seen
One student pointed that the shooter was wearing a bulletproof vest and a helmet. Did you see that? I saw some other kid. When the other kid who came into the classroom, he was wearing some type of thing, and I don't know.
And she said that she saw this man with a hat on, and it had two initials on it from something, and then she just watched him point the gun towards the classroom, and that's when she ducked down.
Just before carrying out the event, Nicholas Cruz created a cell phone video where he said he was going to be the next school shooter. Texas shooter Demetrios Pagortzis was far-left Satanist. Another symbol that the Santa Fe shooter Demetrios Pagortzis posted on Facebook was the Baphomet. Additional patches on the garb included the rising sun, a communist hammer and sickle pin, and a depiction of the idol Baphomet, which Pagortzis said symbolized evil. Patrick Crusius, the El Paso Walmart shooter. Texas shooter shows Satanist background. So once again in this case we find the manifesto. The shooter apparently uploaded a racist manifesto just before starting the attacking. But we also see that narrative of the Civil War, pushing for a civil war, a race war. The 2,300-word screed attributed to the author P. Crusius on one website speaks of a perceived Hispanic invasion of Texas, a detailed plan to segregate ethnic minorities into separate territories of the country, and expresses a belief that white people will soon be ethnically replaced. If you really want to dig deep, you can look into the El Paso shooter's father. He has multiple connections to interesting government entities, we'll say. He's also into New Age beliefs and New Age spirituality. But something else we have in this El Paso event that we've seen in other events is eyewitness testimony is conflicting with the official narrative.
What else did you see? Did you see people running out, that kind of thing?
I even saw the guy with the gun. I saw him twice.
What did he look like? Was he dressed in
Anglo? About 6 foot. He had an AK-47.
Was he dressed in military?
All black. All black. He had a mask. You can see his eyes. That's about it.
¿Eran varias personas? Más que una persona. Ok. Por lo menos dos.
Como 3 o 4 personas.
Ajá. ¿Y cómo estaban vestidos?
Yo los vi de negro.
Okay. So you saw more than one person dressed in black shooting inside the Walmart. ¿Andaban ya uniformados como policías o...?
No les vi la cara, solamente les vi de aquí para abajo, pero traían... Yo los vi todos de negro y traían shorts puestos, no traían pantalón, eran shorts.
Ah, ok.
Y eran ellos los que iban disparando, porque yo nomás vi esas pistolas largas cuando ellos iban así, porque yo miraba la lumbre que miraba.
Connor Betts, the Dayton, Ohio shooter. So here we have another case where one of these solo shooters are found with antidepressants in their bloodstream. So we find the drugs, we find the mental illness, and of course that satanic connection. And there's more stories connecting him with Satanism. This was a really interesting piece of this case. The Dayton shooter, Connor Bett's slain sister, was actually a transgender man. So here's a very interesting coincidence. Parents of teen killed at Parkland were also in El Paso during the Walmart shooting. And this was an interesting connection. Dallas and Orlando shooters went to the same CIA FBI Islamic school. Dallas shooter Micah Johnson attended Islamic seminary school with Orlando shooter Omar Mateen. Here's another one of those strange cases of the same victims showing up in different events. She escaped the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history. Almost 2 years later, she was in Gilroy when a gunman opened fire. We have another interesting connection to the government here. A motion reveals the Pulse gunman's father was an FBI informant. We find another connection with the FBI. Stephen Paddock's girlfriend, Marilou Danley, worked for the FBI.
An FBI document published by Yahoo News found conspiracy theories may be motivating factors for people to commit crimes. According to the document from the agency's Phoenix field office, quote, the FBI assesses anti-government identity-based and fringe political conspiracy theories very likely motivate some domestic extremists, wholly or in part, to commit criminal and sometimes violent activity.
The document says it's the first of its kind to examine this issue and that it will act as a baseline for other investigations. Sharon Weinberger is in our D.C. Bureau, and she's the D.C. Bureau Chief for Yahoo News. She joins us now from Washington to talk more about this. Now, this is interesting because this is getting a lot of attention, especially on social media. Why is this document so significant?
Well, so the FBI has been grappling with for a while how to monitor, how to track, and how to stop domestic extremist or domestic terrorist attacks, particularly as the number of foreign-inspired, Al-Qaeda-inspired ISIS attacks drops off rather precipitously, and we're seeing a rise in domestic extremism like white supremacy. So they've been putting out intelligence bulletins like this, trying to define a threat. This one, which came out a few months ago, as you noted, it identifies conspiracy theories as a potential motivating factor for terrorist threats.
What's the FBI's role in monitoring these types of potential threats?
Well, so the FBI does have primary responsibility for monitoring domestic threats. So unlike the National Counterterrorism Center, which can't monitor threats in the U.S. unless they have a foreign link, unless they're foreign-inspired or foreign-directed. So the FBI is focused on these domestic threats. I think the criticism that some of the people we spoke with had of this approach is that, conspiracy theories have been around a long time, and as one professor noted to me, at one point between 60 and 80% of the American public believed in some form of JFK conspiracy. They're certainly not all, or perhaps any of them, domestic terrorists.
I know you reached out to a number of government agencies for comment on this document. As we said earlier, it was out of a Phoenix field office. What did you learn from some of the agencies you contacted?
That they would really rather not comment on this.